I've heard people say that we don't talk about soup often enough here on the channel, and it is a very, very popular period style food that's popular then, is popular now, and we've done multiple soups here on the channel, 33 at least soups here on the channel, but we wanted to do something that was specifically perfect for this time of year, a harvest soup that really connects with the time of the year, which happens so much in the 18th century. Really, the season is the important part about recipes, and this particular soup is perfect for this season. It's called a white soup, and it's from John Knott's Dictionary on Food. That's from 1723. And there are many different recipes for soup in here. Now, it's interesting that some recipe books from the time period don't really have any soup recipes in it. Maybe because they're too simple, or because some cultural groups really aren't that interested in soup. So, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons here in America, no soup recipes at all. Very, very interesting. And other ones have entire huge chapters on nothing but soup. And if you look in the French cookery books from the time period, you'll find soup recipes, but usually they're very interesting, strange, different style of soups that we don't really do today. So this soup is a classic beef soup that has all kinds of greens and vegetables. Historically, soups are interesting in that we have a lot of diversity here. We have soups that are specifically meant for the table of the wealthy. And then we have soups that are on the very poorest table. The peasants are eating a soup that is made out of the least expensive ingredients possible. And sometimes they might have this sort of everlasting soup, the soup that they just keep cooking over and over again, and whatever's left over, they add some more ingredients and it just keeps going. And this soup could be a bit like that, but we definitely have kind of the full range, and this one sits here in the perfect middle. It could be made into an inexpensive soup, or it could be made for the richest table. The Cook's and Confectioner's Dictionary by John Knott in 1723 is an amazing cookbook for English cookery here in the 18th century. It's from the very beginning of the century, and it has a lot of recipes that continue to go on through other cookbooks later on in the century, like they're copying from it. So I like to go back to the source whenever possible, and this recipe is that. There are lots of soup recipes here, and this one has a lot to say for it. Soup can be something you think is like ultra simple. It's like, well, you take some stock and you throw some ingredients in here. But this one is going to start off from the beginning. To make a white soup, take a 6 pound of neck or ordinary beef, 4 pounds of mutton, boil them in 8 quarts of water very slowly for 2 hours. Scumming it very well, when it is boiled prettily well, take up the meat into a wooden bowl or tray with a little bit of broth, and mash it well with a rolling pin, and put it into the broth again, and cut off each piece of meat before you mash it, to lay it in the middle of the dish. Put in 2 or 3 spoonfuls of oatmeal, season it with salt, a little white pepper, cut half a pound of bacon into pieces, cut a turnip, a parsnip into slices, shred soup herbs, vis-a-vis 2 handfuls of cabbage, savoys, leeks, hard lettuce, white beets, sorrel, and about 10 o'clock, which this is interesting that he bothers to talk about time, at about 10 o'clock, put in 1/2 of them into the soup and the other half about an hour after, or when the soup is enough. Lay in your pieces of meat in your soup dish, pour in your soup, let it over the stove for about an hour, then put in a penny loaf, cut it into slices, the yolks of 5 or 6 eggs, beaten up with a little of the liquor, and stir all well together. Garnish with bread toasted brown. So that seems very, very complicated for a soup. But in fact, there are a lot of things going on here that we would skip over in a modern recipe. So basically, they're making a stock first. So the first third of this recipe is making the soup stock, which many times today we would just go buy a little carton of soup stock and we would skip over all that section. But that's an important thing. If we really want to make the best soup stock, we are going to make it, right? So he explains that in length. He's talking about the kind of cut we're going to use. He talks about using a neck cut. Today, we would probably use a shank cut. So from a beef cow, it's going to be a leg section, either front leg or back legs, whatever. Those are the cheapest meat cuts because they're tough. There's bones in them, connective tissue, and all that good stuff. So we get something that looks like this. It's got a big old bone in the middle of it, but that's actually perfect for soup stock. It's the kind of meat we want to use in our soup stock. It's gonna be like basically a bone broth, and we want to bring all that along. And he talks about boiling this first, then taking the meat out part way through, cutting it up, setting some of those meat pieces aside. That'll be the best part, the tenderest part that'll be in our soup as chunks of meat. And then the rest of it gets squeezed, mashed, and then put back in and boiled. And boiled all by itself for quite a while. Now, some of these soup recipes, they'll call for doing this to the meat, boiling it till it's rags, basically. And at that point, we strain out the meat. So we have just the broth. We already have a little meat cuts later on. We're gonna add a little bit of bacon here to get some extra fat and extra flavor. When that's cooked for a while, we're putting in our root stocks. And we're not using the classic root stocks that we would think about, carrots and potatoes. No, it's got parsnips and turnips in it. Probably because those are a little more popular here in the 18th century than our classic carrots and potatoes especially are, which are gonna be much more popular later on in the 18th century. So we've got these early style of root vegetables that go in here. Notice how some are going in early and some are being held till later so that some break down and other ones stay and give us a little bit of tooth to our soup. We want to have some chunky bits. There's a section that talks about soup herbs, and basically some of these are greens, things that are coming out of the kitchen garden at this time of year that are still good for nutrition. They are not necessarily dried things that you might use much, much later on in the season. And then he gives us a whole list that it's cabbage, it's leeks, it's lettuce, and some other greens that we can toss in here. And there are some soups from this time period, and that's all that's in the soup, basically. It doesn't have any meat broth in it. It's just a soup that's going to be made with these greens. So that's an important part of it, not just flavor, but nutrition. I guess the last part here is the thickeners that go in this. And I think this is an important part of it being a white soup. This soup has oatmeal in it. Now, other ones, if you look at other white soups, they might have other grains here. They might have a barley, they might have a rice, might have vermicelli that kind of gives you that same consistency, something in the bottom that thickens it up. And it's got the bread loaf. Now I think that might be where the white comes in here. That what happens with our bread that we put into the soup is it completely breaks down. It isn't any sort of chunk of bread in there, but it turns into a cloudy mixture in our soup and creates the color for it, instead of it being a clear broth style of a soup. Our soup recipe goes into detail about the soup herbs, but if we truly want to understand this, and this one does go into more detail than usual, if we truly want to understand the soup herbs from the time period, we have to dig into the books on the kitchen garden. And they go into great detail about what really is a soup herb and what isn't. So a lot of times these recipes will just say put in soup herbs. Here's a section of a book that's specifically about kitchen gardens and soup herbs. And it talks about this whole list here. It talks about celery, endive, leeks, lettuce, spinach, green and white beet, chard beets, bugloss, just another herb, pot marigold, parsley, thyme, winter savory, summer savory, marjoram, sweet marjoram, spearmint, which sounds like an interesting thing to put into a soup, basil, and this is extremely interesting, love apple or tomatoes. Now you will find almost no recipe books, except for maybe some manuscript cookbooks from the 18th century that mention the cooking of tomatoes, or as they call them sometimes, love apples. But here we have the mention of them in this soup herb. So we know that some of these soups, even in English or possibly American cookery in the 18th century, are using them, even though some people think they're poisonous. The soup is ready, and this was an amazing process, start to finish. You know, we started off with the making of the broth, and then you took basically hours to create this here in the kitchen, but the smell is incredible, over the top. You can tell this is going to be an amazingly filling soup. It is so thick and so full of different ingredients. I can't imagine how you could make it any more complicated. And yet, there's nothing very expensive in here. It uses one of the least expensive cuts of meat, simple greens that come out of the garden, some root vegetables, a little bit of oatmeal, one loaf of bread, that's it. The recipe even calls for making croutons, and if you're gonna do this, you might as well do it. Make your own croutons, they will be great. Let's try this out. And I went ahead and let it cool down just a touch. It's still nice and warm. And you can see, boy, it is just thick, thick, thick. And we're gonna find one of those pieces of meat that we just slightly warmed back up and put in here so that it didn't get too overcooked, turn to rags. We don't want that. Wow. This has everything. It has all the flavors you want in it, all the wonderful greens, just getting you want a little bit of different texture, you bring a crouton in there, you've got the root vegetables for the different color and the different flavors. This is probably the best harvest time soup you could ever make.